There we go. Excellent. Welcome to our first ever Student to Scholar Colloquium. Today, we will hear from Dr. Travis Weiland, who is a 2017 graduate of our PhD program. Before joining UMass Dartmouth, Travis was a high school teacher, and since graduation, he's held 2 different positions as assistant professor, one at Appalachian State University and his current position at the University of Houston. Travis's work is built on 2 principles: that education is transformative and that the goal of public education is democratic equality. Given this, it makes sense that his research is focused on equity, including consideration of issues of access, achievement, identity, and power as they intersect with statistics education and data science education. Travis is interested in design work that allows him to co-construct learning environments with teachers to learn statistics through investigating socio-political issues and to translate such learning experiences into their mathematics classrooms. We are delighted to have Travis back with us today to share his insights. And he has noted, in addition to Q&A at the end, if you want to throw questions in the comments as we go, he's happy to get those as he's talking. So I will turn it over to Travis.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today with y'all. And hopefully some people will find this useful. It was fun to put together, thinking of it, because it's a very different kind of presentation than what I typically do. So it was kind of interesting to kind of think back, but feel free to throw things in the chat. I'll keep it up. I have 2 screens going here. And then that way, if you all have questions as we go along, that's fine. This can totally be kind of more of an open dialogue as we go along with that as well. I'm perfectly happy to kind of engage in those questions as you all come up with them. And what I'm going to talk through is kind of the journey that I've gone through. So this is kind of my realization that led me here, was that I realized I had no idea what statistics was or how to teach it well, which is kind of what brought me to UMass Dartmouth. But I'm going to kind of talk back a little bit and kind of start off like, where did that inkling come from? And then kind of as I go along, kind of talk through some of the things that I've learned along the way from faculty at UMass Dartmouth and other mentors and things like that along the way. And a lot of this is things that you don't really learn in your courses per se. It's the kind of stuff that you pick up as you go along in your career. And so I totally understand that that is something that might be new for some folks that they hear about it. I've kind of peppered in kind of my research trajectory as part of that, because that's part of what has guided me through these different stages of my career. And also try to kind of unpack some of those decisions that were made at different points. So I try to be kind of very open about, I made certain decisions for certain reasons, and try to open that up so that as you're kind of thinking through, if you're, a student thinking through your own journey, what kind of questions you might want to ask yourself as you're trying to think about, what do I want to do and where do I want to go, and thinking through that kind of that perspective. So presently, I'm an assistant professor of mathematics education. I'm at an R1 institution, so I have the wonderful 2-2 teaching load, which allows me to do more research, and also allows me to teach methods courses for our undergraduates and our graduate students. And my research, as Chandra said, is very much focused on kind of intersections of equity, justice, and statistics education. And now more and more data science education, as that has kind of become a big thing. But where did I start? So I try to be very adamant about the privilege that brings me to the places that I'm at. I am a white middle-class male. I had a private high school education. These are all things, privileges that have allowed me to enter spaces in different ways than might be afforded to other people. And so I try to be very transparent about that. And also too, I think it gives you some sense of my balance of background. I've kind of been all over the place in very different places. And so I have a very equity and justice oriented mindset, but my high school education was rather conservative, actually. Even though it's a Catholic high school, it was run by the Jesuits, which is kind of a special flavor of Catholicism, if you all are familiar with those. They are very social justice oriented. And so some of the justice orientation that I currently carry out now kind of came out of my education in the high school area, and has kind of come back up in different ways as I've gone along. And that high school preparation kind of made it so that I could kind of go to wherever college I wanted to, but I really wanted to be a teacher. And at the time, I wanted to kayak in the summer times. And so I went, teaching is a great job. I feel like math is pretty easy and teachers get summers off. And so that seems great. and somebody from this college in the mountains of North Carolina was like, hey, we got a whitewater kayaking team, come down here and you get a teaching degree. And I said, that sounds perfect. I will say, as a teacher, I never once ended up with a summer off. So my thought as to like, I want to go into teaching for this was totally off base. Actually, I can't even, I don't know if I've had a summer off since I was a kid. So it just doesn't quite work out that way. But so it was a big shift in educational settings, though. So Warren Wilson is a work college. It's very unique in that, and it's very much like John Dewey kind of a place to be. So everybody works as part of the university. It has a fully working farm. I learned how to be an electrician's assistant while I was there, and did all the work on the buildings and things like that. And it is a very, very liberal environment too. So it's kind of a big shift from being an environment where like people are very much like voting Republican and talking about like, kind of pro-life kind of perspectives, to a place that's very pro-choice, very much like always voting kind of Democrat, or even like as far left as you could go kind of perspective. So that was a big shift kind of where I was at. And then two, this is where I really started to get into the mathematics education side of things, but they were still separated. So I was a major in mathematics, took all the mathematics courses, no statistics courses. And then I also majored in secondary education. And there was really no overlap between those two things. It was, you're going to learn how to teach over here and you're going to learn math over here. And there wasn't any like, you're going to learn how to teach math ever in my kind of undergraduate experience, which is less often today, but is still a very common occurrence to have people that have kind of gone through this background. So once I kind of got done, graduated, immediately jumped into teaching at high school, still in the mountains of North Carolina. I try to put these images on here because you get the, the sense of the beauty of the area. It was a very rural high school. It's in a county where you have Asheville, North Carolina, which, if you're familiar with that, is a rapidly growing city. But Inca, the high school that I taught at, was very much on the fringe of that county. Very much kind of people living in hills and hollers perspective. There were, people that had immigrated here as Scottish immigrants way back at the founding of the country and still lived in the same coves as their families moved into when they moved out here. And there was very much a perspective of kind of like the city is where the strange people are, and we don't go there. We stay out in the kind of the country area. So it's also very isolating kind of perspective. And I mostly taught freshman inclusion classes. So these are a lot of students that were often repeating courses, had a lot of specialized needs to kind of support their learning. And I did this for 5 years. And during that time period, was almost laid off due to cuts, budgetary cuts that they had back in that time period. And that sparked me to go, I need some other options here, because if it's going to be this easy to kind of lose my job, I need to have other job perspectives. And so the idea of going back and getting a master's was something that popped into my head. And luckily there was a program not far away. And this was the first time that I met someone that identified as a mathematics educator. Didn't know that was a thing. And the program was mostly mathematics courses, but we had a part of that was mathematics education courses. And those faculty were the faculty that really kind of pushed me to start thinking about going into maybe getting a PhD. But part of that coursework was mathematics courses, but this is also the first time where I finally got to take a course in statistics. So that's funny because I hadn't taken statistics before. I'd been teaching a bunch of statistics. And at the same time, these mathematics educators were trying to convince me to get a PhD. And I was like, I don't want to go do a bunch of math courses. Like, I don't want a PhD in mathematics. And so they were the first people that were like, no. You can get a PhD in mathematics education where you study teaching and learning. And I was like, oh, I didn't, that wasn't even a thing that I knew existed at that point. And so they're the ones that really kind of convinced me to do it. And similarly, at the same time, the more I was learning, the more I was becoming kind of jaded as to how the public education system works. The more you know statistics, the more you become kind of a danger to administrators, I feel like sometimes, because they like to tout a lot of statistics and they don't often always know what they're talking about. And so if you're the person in the room that knows it, you start to ask these questions and start to realize, I don't know if the people in charge really know what they're talking about. And so that made me really start to think like research maybe is a thing that I want to engage in and do more of. And in particular, taking those 2 statistics courses that I taught, and I happen to be lucky that I had a really engaging, really just awesome statistician as a faculty member who taught me those courses. It made me start to realize that I'd been teaching statistics to these high school students, but I really had no idea what statistics was. Like I was teaching how to calculate mean, median, and mode, but I really didn't know what those measures meant. I didn't know how statistics was useful to make sense of the world. And so that's what really got me excited. And then that's really what sparked my research interest too, of saying, well, if I don't really know what's happening and I was expected to teach statistics, is this something that's happening more widely? Which the answer is yes, actually very, very widely, which is kind of sparked my then research trajectory that I've kind of gone on with from there. So to kind of test out the waters, I had a really unique opportunity in my 5th year of teaching high school. One of the faculty members at my undergrad institution reached out to me and said, we need somebody to teach a bunch of math courses, and we need somebody to just be able to come in here and just do it without much help. And so they wanted me to do it because they're like, you know how to teach because you already have a teaching degree, and you know how Warren Wilson works, which is a strange, quirky place. And so that kind of worked out in my favor because I was already thinking about doing a PhD program, and it was like, oh, okay, I can kind of test out like, what is it like to be in a college setting? And at the same time, I also picked up work at a community college in the area and then a for-profit college. So I really got a very diverse perspective of different teaching environments through this year that I did this. Anywhere from that community college experience to the for-profit, which I would say avoid for-profit. I learned that real quick. They're real sketchy. And in the liberal arts environment too, and what that could mean and what that would look like in teaching mathematics. And at the same time, I started applying for PhD programs. And at the time, my partner at the time was very much wanted to move back home. And so New England became kind of a geographical bounding region for programs to consider. And the 2 main programs that I considered was the University of New Hampshire's Math Ed program and UMass Dartmouth's. And in looking at those 2 programs, what really attracted me to UMass Dartmouth was the flexibility to explore what I wanted to explore. When I looked at University of New Hampshire, I was going to be able to take a ton of math courses, and I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to focus mostly on doing the educational side of work. And so it just wasn't a good fit for me. And that's something to consider too, when you start looking at universities beyond as a student for where you want to work, is what's that university's philosophy? And I found UMass Dartmouth's kind of philosophy and educational perspective as far more attractive for what I wanted to do as a student. So I ended up in UMass Dartmouth, which you can see are wonderful buildings there, which are their own special, unique form of architecture, as we all know, and aren't always good at keeping water out of the buildings. And that was a unique experience, as most of you know, because you get to, it's a mathematics education PhD. When I started there, that's the only program that was there, but you already had a lot of science ed faculty. And so half my faculty was math ed, half were science ed. I was doing statistics, which is kind of a bridge between the 2. And so it was a really unique space for me to really start to explore ideas openly and look at kind of these interdisciplinary perspectives. And throughout my entire time there, I worked on Chandra's career grant as a research assistant, which was hugely helpful and informative for me because it opened doors and provided opportunities to do things like go to research conferences, present, write manuscripts, and just learn more of the inner workings of how do you be a researcher. Those are things that you learn in your classes, but it's not the same as like living it in those things. And your classes are only so many hours a week. So in a research assistantship, I was immersed in doing research 20 hours a week, every week of the year. And so that really like gets you to dig into it. I don't even know if I get to spend 20 hours a week doing research these days. I mean, I guess if I consider all the paperwork I have to do on grants, part of that, then maybe, but it really gets you to, allows you to dig into those things. And so those opportunities were coupled with other things too. I also got to teach master's courses, which I hadn't taught before. One of those master's courses I got to do with Dave, who was on here, as part of I think that was the Coast Project. And that was a really nice opportunity to look at how do you bridge ideas between math and science teachers. I got to do a research internship as part of my work at UMass Dartmouth, at Vanderbilt with Rich Lear, who I still kind of keep in touch with today. And I got to learn about building community with Tangent, the student doctoral group, which hopefully is still around, but I don't know. And so these were all great opportunities. And Colloquium. I can tell you from being at several different institutions, the Caput Center Colloquium series is a very unique and special opportunity that I learned a lot from, getting into engage with these scholars and have scholarly discourse outside of what I was learning in my classes. And the other side of this was the coursework, though. So the things that I learned after leaving UMass and kind of reflecting back on my experiences was that the courses are only really a small part of being a doctoral student. I mean, it's an important part, but it's just a piece in the puzzle. And really getting out of those courses, things of like, how does this connect to what you want to do? So thinking through as you're taking courses, how do you leverage those towards things like presentations or publications, going beyond just, completing these courses. And then also always trying to make the most of a course. So every time I was in a course, I always tried to think about, okay, there's certain things in here that maybe don't seem super applicable to what I'm doing, but there's other things that are really helpful to me. How do I really pull the most out of this course and really use it as something that's going to help me in the future? And the coursework too really helped me start to find ideas that spoke to me. When I first came in, I was very much focused on kind of teacher knowledge for teaching statistics. The equity and social justice lens didn't come in until my coursework, where I was exposed to those ideas and I started to go, wait a second, I really see these things as intersecting and melding in really fascinating, interesting ways. And I wouldn't have seen that if I hadn't really thrown myself into the coursework and really thought about, how does this connect to what I want to do and my ideas as I went through the program. Research is the other side of it. So always trying to think of like, how do I carry out research as part of what I'm doing? How do I study the things that I'm doing? So I was able to take advantage of a research assistantship. And if you're not doing that currently, I would highly encourage you to try to do that if there's opportunity. But also finding research internships. That was built into the program when I was there, and that was a huge opportunity. And going outside of the UMass faculty to do that as well. The more faculty you get to know at other institutions, the more perspectives you get to gain, the more different ways of thinking about doing research and what counts as research. It's just a way to kind of open your mind to different perspectives. And always looking for opportunities to how do you present places? How do you start to try to write those publications? And really, how do you start to develop your own researcher identity? Like, who do you want to be as a scholar and as a researcher? And it doesn't have to be the same as the people that you're working with or working for, or the faculty at the institution that you're at. You start to pull together who is it that you want to be, and what is it that you want to engage in. And there's constant professional activities beyond that too. So you're seeing a theme of go to conferences. That's a really important one, because that's where the people in your field are. That's where you get to network and communicate with them. Now more and more, there's of course webinars. I mean, we've gone virtual with so much because of the pandemic that connections are a lot easier, but they're also less personal in a way. So still getting to places face-to-face, interacting with people in person is a huge part of kind of networking as becoming an academic, and just knowing how to carry out conversations with other academics. How do you talk about your work? And part of that is learning how to actually communicate your work, which is a huge part of being an academic, is communicating what you're doing to somebody that isn't necessarily an expert in what you're talking about. And this was something that I was told in the most salient memory to me was Stephen Hegedus, who was there my first year, saying, you need to schedule time to think about stuff into your schedule, which I didn't realize was like a thing that I should think about. And that actually was a very impactful thing for me to hear. And I still try to do that today. Of part of what we do is think about stuff. And so if you don't schedule time in or make space for you to like just sit and be with your thoughts, to reflect on these things, then you're really kind of like running around doing a bunch of stuff, but you're not necessarily looking at how do these things connect, or how do these build to larger ideas. And so that time to just sit and think is really, really important in what you're doing. And it's also one of the hardest things to save time for, because it's not like a tangible product. We're always like, oh, how do we produce this, this, and this? Well, thinking is going to lead to those things ideally, but it's a very kind of disconnected leading to those things. And so it's really kind of important to make sure that you're saving yourself time to read and to reflect continually as part of your kind of professional activities of what you're doing. In service. So a big part of being a tenure track faculty member is service, and it can eat an ungodly amount of your time if you let it. But it's good to start doing some service when you're a doctoral student. And part of the service opportunities that I was kind of pushed into, in positive ways, I should say, was starting to review for conferences. And that really helped me see, well, first it helped me realize, oh, wait, maybe I'm better at doing this than I thought I was, because these things that I'm reviewing aren't as good as some of the other things that I've seen other people write in my program. But it also helps you understand, like, how do you write a good proposal? Because you read some of these and you're like, wow, that's a great proposal. Well, how did they write that proposal? What made it good versus, wow, this one was bad. All right, well, what made it bad? Like, what do I want to avoid? And sometimes reading those would then lead me to go, wait, I'm doing this in mine. I need to go fix that because that's not working well. And so that's a really important opportunity to have. Also, though, looking for ways to kind of get into the community based on your expertise. So I tried to do professional development with schools, just volunteer in schools doing things, work with nonprofits, things like that, because that start to build your network. And it might not seem like a tangible thing that you're doing at the time, but in my experience, those have turned into all sorts of different opportunities that I never would have realized, that have been super helpful. Part of the grant work I do now is really based on relationships I developed over years and years and years of service to different aspects of the community. And the only reason I'm able to do that grant work now is because of those relationships that I formed. And so some of this stuff is really important to kind of think about of not just like, what does it do for me, but also what do these things impact, and how do they start to create space to maybe do larger, better things as a good to the community and what you're doing. And publish. I mean, the reality is we have to publish as academics. It's kind of like one of the main currencies. But that doesn't mean just like publish random garbage, right? Like, really think about what are your ideas that are really important and how can you turn them in and share them. So I try to think of publishing more as, how do I share important ideas with the field? And I kind of have an advocacy perspective. So oftentimes when I go to write a paper, I have a goal in mind. I want to push people to think in a different way. And that's what I try to do with my writing, is then try to say, okay, how do I open up more of a space for this? Or how do I try to get people thinking in different ways with the things that I'm publishing? And being in an interdisciplinary space like I am, which audience do I need to push in different ways? I have to push statisticians in different ways than math educators, and stats educators different ways than data scientists. And so which community am I going to speak to, and how do I want to push them in different directions based on what I'm trying to do? And so I was really lucky in that I was able to publish as a doctoral student, and this is based on my dissertation work, and based on, honestly, using this in my courses. So oftentimes it was built into our courses to write a paper based on ideas that we were learning and give each other feedback. I got a ton of feedback from my classmates on this paper to be able to write it. And that was a big part too of what's become the foundation of my grant work now, of the work that I've done. And so it was really helpful for me, and the faculty pushed me to do this too, and were very supportive of me doing this. So this wouldn't be possible without all those support systems that I had going through the program to be able to get something out like this while I was still a doctoral student. So dissertation, I learned a lot through my dissertation. My dissertation is by no means perfect. And the thing that I've heard again and again and again from scholars is that the dissertation is the beginning, not the end. You're starting to put ideas together. You're starting to play with things. Yeah, you want it to be good, but good and perfect are different things. And honestly, I don't believe that research is perfect or ever can be perfect. And so that's an epistemological kind of stance of my own. But thinking of, how do you pull together and start to build the basis of what you want your career to be? What do you want to start to investigate? What's the beginning problem that you want to tackle in what you're doing? And the other thing, and now that I get to advise doctoral students, this has really become even more salient to me, is be realistic. What can you do with the resources you have, which is typically you got zero money and you have some time. So like, what can you do with that? And what do you actually have access to? A huge part of research is access. Like, do I have access to the people I want to do this stuff with? Do I have access to schools to go in and do this work? Do I have access to the data that I need? Can I get access to these things? And so thinking through like realistically what you can do. I did textbook analysis, not because I love doing textbook analysis. In fact, it's quite tedious, but I could learn from it. I could start to put together the theoretical ideas that I wanted to, and it was easy to access at the time. I didn't think that I could go find a classroom doing the types of things that I was looking for and study how that would work in the wild, because I thought it would take me years to find that classroom. And so I decided instead to be a little more pragmatic and go, well, let's look at what textbooks are doing, because written curriculum is a very important part of supporting teachers. What resources are out there, and how do they kind of construct statistics, and how do I start to play with theories with this work as well, and dabble in those spaces. And that's really what I used my dissertation for. And then thinking about, how do you start to publish off of this? Like, what are pieces that I can carve off? So my theoretical framework, I was able to carve off and turn into that ESM piece that I showed us a minute ago. But I've done more pieces since then off of it. And that's a challenge, because a dissertation is a behemoth, and then carving off little pieces of it coherently becomes its own unique task as well. The other thing that I've learned over the years is that your committee is super crucial to your success. They are there to support you, and you want to pick a committee that's going to support you in what you need to do. You want a chair that's going to be a critical friend and a cheerleader for you. That's what they're there for, is to support you through the process and to support you through becoming a PhD. But at the same time, you don't want them to just be like, yeah, everything's sunshine and rainbows. You want them to give you quality feedback. You want them to push back when you need pushing back. You also want to pick a committee that's full of members that are similarly going to support you. You don't want committee members that are going to not see similar lines. People in research have different ontological and epistemological beliefs. Your goal with a dissertation is not to convince every different epistemology that your work is worth doing. That is not an endeavor you should try to tackle. You want a committee that is supportive of the ideas that you have and is there to help you build them better. That's going to help you create these things in constructive ways and be supportive. And so that's really important too. And also picking committee members that are going to be there for you in the long term. I still connect with my committee members in different ways on different projects. And another thing I point out to doctoral students that I work with now, and this is when I first start working with a doctoral student, I tell them right off the bat, I'm like, I'm your advisor right now. Over the next 2 years, you're going to learn a bunch of stuff and you're going to change as a person, which means you might decide that you need a completely different chair for what you're going to do, because your idea goes off in a complete different direction than when you started out. And so always kind of knowing that your chair doesn't have to be your advisor that you come in with. They can be someone different. And I shifted multiple times for various logistical and idea-based reasons to kind of end up where I was in the end with what I was doing. And that's really important, is to think through that process as well. And then the other thing you want to think through with your dissertation in general as a student, and this was something that I was pushed to do very early on, was think about, well, what do you want to do when you get this PhD? There's a lot of stuff you can do with a PhD. So what is it that you want this for? And I often will ask, when people are interested in joining our PhD program here at Houston, that's one of the first questions I ask them is like, what do you want a PhD for? Because it's a big commitment. And if what you want it for is something that you don't really need it for, then I would rather talk you out of it than throw you into something. And then you realize after like 4 to 6 years of blood, sweat, and tears that you're like, oh, wait, I didn't need to do this. And also just making sure it's a good fit. Each university PhD program is very different, and the faculty shape them in different ways. And you interact with faculty in such a deeper level in a PhD program than you often do at other programs. And so it's really important to think about that. You know, do you want to go off and be a tenure track faculty member? I mean, that's one thing. Versus I want to learn how to be a researcher so I can go work for a think tank or some research firm or things like that. Or I want to go work for maybe like a nonprofit or a curriculum developer or a for-profit. There are all sorts of options out there. I had a good friend of mine just leave to go work for Meta to do, he does quality control for interactions with people or something like that. Because he's a researcher and he likes the quantitative side, and he knows how to develop surveys, and he bridges between the people that just do the coding and don't really interact with people and maybe don't necessarily want to interact with people, even though what they're coding is specifically designed for interactions with people. And so these are all different kind of spaces that you can move into with a PhD, and they require different skill sets, and they're different kind of trajectories that you're going to go on. And ideally, your dissertation and what you're doing is going to aim you towards what that is. I even, when I'm a committee member, I think about what kind of feedback I'm going to give on a dissertation differently based on where they're trying to go with it, because there's kind of different levels of what you're trying to do with this. And different types of support that I provide based on where they might want to aim towards with that. And the other thing I'd say is talk to people that are in the positions you want to be in. So we sometimes get blinders in academia because most of us that are tenure track faculty are the ones that are doing the PhD training, and we haven't done other jobs like work for think tanks or been curriculum developers or worked for nonprofits. So we don't really, I mean, we know that stuff exists out there, but we don't necessarily know what's the best way to get to it, right? So we're really good at reproducing ourselves of other faculty members, but there's other things out there. And so I always encourage folks, like, if that's what you want to do is go work for a nonprofit, well, let's connect you with people that do that. So you can start to figure out, and I can start to figure out what you need to do to kind of go in that direction. The other thing to do, and I'd say do this early on, start looking at job postings, not because you're necessarily going to apply for them, but to look for what are the qualifications they want to have there. Are there courses that you need to take that are outside of your required courses? Are there types of products that you need to do? Perhaps maybe you need to do an evaluation study. Maybe you need to, maybe publishing isn't as important for what you want to go into, but developing certain lesson structures or something else is, or white papers or policy type things. There could be a lot of different things. So starting to think about, you know, what are the jobs that you want to inhabit asking for, and are you doing the things to set yourself up for that? Even in faculty tenure track jobs, a lot of the math ed jobs now are asking for 2 to 3 years of prior teaching experience. They're asking for, if you're in a math department, you have to have 18 graduate credit hours of mathematics. So like, do you have those things to be able to take up those jobs at those institutions you want to be at? That's a really important thing to think through so that you can start to build those into your doctoral experience. And then two, in that career trajectory, network with folks that are in those jobs, get to know them. You never know who's going to be on a hiring committee for you when you go out for these jobs, and having relationships with them ahead of time can make things a lot smoother in interactions with them. You also got to think about, what are your constraints? Are you geographically bound? Like, you are in this part of the country and that you're not going to leave. That's totally fine. But be honest with that ahead of time and think about, well, what jobs could I have in this region? What are my family constraints about what I have to do? Or my partner, what's their job? Are they going to be mobile in what they're doing? Where does their work exist? Those are all really important things to consider early on. I was lucky in that I was pretty open. My family, I didn't care if I was close to them. That's just me personally, right? My partner at the time was pretty open to moving around places. So that gave me a lot of freedom in my kind of trajectory to go to different locations. I didn't feel bound anywhere. And always talk to your advisor about these things, because your advisor knows lots of people from their years in the field that they can connect you to that might help you think through some of these issues, or they might have gone through these things themselves. So in my early career trajectory, and I pulled this from a cover letter I wrote in, I think it was 2016 for a job, because I was like, I don't even remember what I said my career trajectory was back then. So I basically, it's very broad and vague. And I will say, you work on refining these with your advisor. So, I started talking about my research experience are broadly centered on teaching and learning mathematics and statistics, middle and high school. I was trying to keep it pretty open because I was like, I need a job. So I want somebody to see this and go, yeah, that fits in here, and we want to hire this person. And then I get a little bit more into, I want to build off this theoretical framework that I have, create and enact learning experiences, things along that nature. So it was somewhat broad, but still specific enough that it's clear, like, this person has a niche that they're really interested in statistics. They're real interested in statistical literacy and critical literacy along with that. But they're kind of flexible, and like, they've done some math ed stuff, some stats ed stuff, middle school, high school. There's some space in there, which I'm not saying that's the way you have to go. That's just that's the route that I took when I was applying and thinking about it. So to give you a sense of then the job experience, it is an experience, and it's not a fun one. It's a lot of work. So I graduated in the summer of 2017, but I started applying for stuff as early as, I think, August 2016, maybe even earlier than that. And I applied to jobs all over the place. So I have 18 graduate credit hours of mathematics, which means I can live in a mathematics department. So I applied to math jobs, I applied to education jobs, and I applied to mathematics education jobs. Might have even had a STEM ed job in there somewhere. And I applied to 16 different institutions. I had only one campus interview. I think I had 5 phone interviews. I put this on some of the other slides, but I couldn't remember that far back that clearly. And only one job offer. So I took it because I was like, I need a job. Here's an offer. It actually ends up taking me back to North Carolina in the mountains, which is a place I love anyways. So it seemed like a great fit at the time. In thinking through that, when you're applying to places, some of it's I want a job, and some of it's is this place going to fit. So for me at the time, it seemed like it would be a great fit. Is master's granting institution, teaching focused, but still research space. That seemed like a really good fit for me at the time. So as a number of you are doc students, I kind of wanted to talk through just some general advice I have on going on the job market. Because you might hear this from your advisors, but I know when I talk to my advisees, they're kind of like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah, you're just like trying to overwarn us or something like that. So hearing it from multiple people, sometimes it clicks on the light bulb or makes you think about it in different ways. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You're going to be engaged in the job hunt for like 6 to 7 months straight, because you start applying to stuff in July, August, and then as those kind of go out, you might get some phone interviews, and then you keep applying to more things. Then you get some phone interviews, you apply to more things, maybe you do a campus interview. It's like a continual process, and you probably won't have any kind of offer in hand until like January or February, maybe even later. And so that's a lot of time. And it also takes a lot of planning ahead of time. And you really need to find space and time for yourself during this too. So you're doing this typically simultaneous with trying to finish your dissertation, which in and of itself is its own large task that you're diving into, right? And having support networks. So I met other graduate students that were on the job market at the same time, and we would share information with one another, because you kind of get ghosted a lot of times in these things. Like you just don't hear anything, and you're like, I don't know, like, should I have heard something? Am I not under consideration anymore? So one of the things we would do is anytime one of us got a phone interview or a campus interview, we would let the others know if they'd applied to that job, like, hey, they're sending out invites to phone interviews right now. And that gave us a better sense of like where things were in progress or things along that. And I would say prepare for 10 to 20 hours of work a week. It is a long endeavor. Don't take rejection personally. You're going to get rejected a lot as an academic. That's just part of what we do. You'll still take it personally, but like, that's why I said, make sure you leave yourself time and space to process these things. You get a lot of silent rejection in the job hunt. It's just part of how it works. And you hurry up and wait a lot. You hurry up and get all these documents in, and then you wait to hear something for maybe a month later. And then you do a phone interview, and then you wait for another month to hear if you have a campus interview. And so it's a really kind of frustrating process a lot of times because of that. And so this is always done through committees. It's a whole bunch of people, and you don't know any of the politics of these committees or how the institutions work. So there's a lot of behind the scenes things that you have no idea anything about, which is why I also say don't take things personally, because it might be that they were looking for something special, or somebody's got a particular idea in mind of what they want. There's all sorts of crazy things that go in there. But typically if you get a phone interview, you're down to the 10 to 20 applicants pool with that. When you move into the campus interview, you're probably down to like 3, maybe 5. Usually it's 3 other people. So they really want you at that point. Like you're in a really good position, and a lot of your job when you go to that campus interview is really just to show, I'm not crazy, I can interact with people, I'm the kind of person you'd want to work with if I get tenure here for the next 10, 20, 30 years, and I know how to talk about things. I can teach classes okay. Like it's really more about like, are you personally a fit? Oftentimes on the campus interview for a lot of that stuff. And you want to ask how they do the selection process. I learned this the hard way. It varies drastically. Sometimes the dean is the one that makes all the decisions. Sometimes it's the department chair. Sometimes it's the committee. Sometimes they rank choices. Sometimes they give pros and cons for each. They're all different systems. And so this is something to kind of ask about ahead of time so that you know, how is this going to work? And also that helps you have a sense of like, who am I needing to like pay more attention to or talk to in different ways, or really like try to sell myself to, I guess you could say. That's an important thing to think through as you're doing these campus interviews. And then organize yourself. So like I applied to 16 that time. You'll see later on one of my years of applications, I did 30. If you don't organize stuff with the deadlines and all the paperwork that you're doing, you'll get lost and it'll get ugly and you'll get things in late. And if you get things in late, people don't look at them. So it's really important to do that, and budgeting that time to prepare and submit those applications is really, really crucial. Like I can't emphasize that enough. It eats ridiculous amounts of your time applying for jobs. And if you get to the campus interview part, the amount of prep work that you do just for those 2 days it's a lot. So just kind of be ready, and it's sudden. All of a sudden, like you're like, oh, in 2 weeks, I got to be prepared to do yada, 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 on top of all the other stuff that I'm doing. So being able to kind of jump into that. So job docs, the biggest thing is start early. Like I wrote my first drafts in, I think, June. And I gave them to Chandra, and she's like, this is nice. Here's some things you should think about. And you should probably start from scratch again. It'll just be easier for you. I was like, okay. And then I worked through them again and again and got more feedback and things like that. And I continue to change these over the years as I apply to jobs. But it's important to have those things ahead of time because creating them from scratch and getting feedback takes time. It really does take time. And so getting feedback ahead of time so that you're really conveying yourself, because it's just these documents that they're making their initial decisions off of. So if your stuff doesn't stand out or doesn't read well, and it could be the littlest thing, that's going to knock you out of the pool already. And so these documents become super crucial from the beginning. And the CV, like that's when you should start from like day one and constantly update that thing because you'll forget the things that you've done as you go along. So always, like I think I started mine maybe the summer of my first year, and I would update it anytime I got new stuff. I made sure to update that thing because it's not particularly hard at the time, but like if you only do it once a year, it becomes a task to go back and remember those things. And you want to personalize your cover letters. The worst thing you can do is forget to change a university's name in there, or you're writing some cover letter that's super generic that people are like, I mean, this could be any institution that you're writing to, which some disciplines do. I've learned this from being on hiring committees for mathematicians and statisticians. They operate differently than we do. But for a math ed job or an ed job, you want to personalize that thing. Like you've done some research to this institution, and you're applying to this institution, and you're trying to convince this institution that they should hire you. And so thinking through that. It's a hurry up and wait game. Yeah, it really is. And just be ready for that and be ready for the emotional roller coaster that causes as much as you can. If you haven't heard anything from somebody for 3 months, you're probably out. I mean, that's usually a safe bet. But anywhere before that, it's kind of like, it depends on how fast the committee moves. It depends on how the institution moves, what kind of HR hurdles they got to jump through. There's all sorts of things behind the scenes that you know nothing about and you won't hear anything about. And so that's a real struggle oftentimes for folks of like, well, I haven't heard anything 2 weeks. Is that good or bad? It's like, I don't know. It could be either. So, okay, so that's applying for jobs. So I landed my first job, right? I'm at Appalachian State. I got a 3-3 teaching load, low research expectations, a balanced amount of service, I would say. It was pretty realistic. And I thought it was a really good fit at the time. So, and this is something to think about, like, what are the things that are important for you in a job? So these are the things that were important to me at the time, and these are how they fit. So teaching is important to me, and that was a great fit for me there. Research is important to me, and I got to do research there, but I sometimes struggled with how little research I got to do. Research to practice is also really important. How do you bring this thing to teachers? How do you make this actually work out there in the field? And that was a so-so fit. Like, it was a decent institution for that. The bad fit things for me there were, I didn't feel like the people I was working with stayed connected or current in the field of math ed. I felt like they'd kind of gotten their PhDs and froze. And that for me was a struggle personally, because I didn't feel like I had people to communicate with about the ideas that I wanted to communicate with them on. And Karen, what I mean by a 3-3 teaching load is 3 classes in the fall and 3 classes in the spring. And so a 2-2 teaching load would be 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. Sometimes there's flexibility, like people might do 3 one semester and then just 1 another semester. That's typically what it means for those loads. Sometimes it's by credit hours is how they'll calculate them. Like you have to teach a total of blank number of credit hours each year, however you want to distribute that across the semesters. The other issue I had where I was that issues of equity and justice were really important to me. And I didn't realize just how much it irked me to be in a department where I had a lot of people that really did not value those things and wanted nothing to do with them. Did not see them connected to what they were doing. And I should say at that institution, I was in a department of mathematical sciences, and math departments are a different space than colleges of ed or departments of curriculum and instruction. And so there were people in there that did value these things, but as a whole, the department probably didn't as much. And so that was a struggle for me at times. And I really had to push a lot in spaces. And it was a frustration that would really grate on me at times. Work-life balance is another thing you want to consider at institutions. Some institutions work you to death, and others, they'll still say that they have a good work-life balance. That's always what everybody claims, right? But really looking at what, in your day-to-day, do you feel like you're balanced or not? There, I felt very balanced. My workload was never overwhelming unless I made it that way. And so sometimes I would carry out a lot more research because I wanted to be more research active. And so that would make my workload a little overwhelming, but I was doing that because I wanted to do it, not because the job was making me do it. The location was great for me. I got to go hiking. I was outside all the time. I could easily leave work at the office and just say it's not there anymore. But I did have issues of, it was too far from my partner at the time. And so that became a struggle too, of the commute that I would have to do with that in terms of location. And these are all things you want to think about as part of this, because finding a job isn't just about the job, it's about how does the job balance with your life? Because being an academic can be an all-consuming endeavor. And if you let it consume you, it doesn't lead to healthy lifestyles. And then you want to think about here's the 3 buckets then that you always consider when you're an academic: research, teaching, and service. Those are the 3 buckets that you get evaluated on. So for me, research there, I didn't have a lot of time to do research because I was mostly teaching. So I had to be really opportunistic in how I was going to publish about things. So I really wanted to be at an R1, I think, in the future. And so I had to be scrappy about how I would publish because of that, because I didn't have time to do the same type of research that people at R1 have, or the same type of support or financial support. I tried to finish off projects that I did in grad school. So I was still publishing with Chandra off work when I was in my early years, because publishing takes forever for some articles. I was publishing off my dissertation, so research that I've kind of done, but parsing that into manuscripts. Kind of spent time looking for collaborators, and I tried to really leverage my teaching and service as much as possible. Teaching in particular, how can I study the things that I'm teaching in my classes? Because I got to do all this teaching anyways, but I'm teaching math, I'm teaching stats, those are things I'm interested in. How can I learn from studying what I'm doing myself? Teaching was exciting for me because I got to teach math courses, stats courses, math ed courses. It was really cool to be flexible. But here's the problem that I ran into in my advice to other people when they start out. Don't start teaching every course under the sun because it seems like a cool idea. Because now all of a sudden you got all these preps and you're constantly redesigning courses. Like it killed me. I mean, I learned a lot, don't get me wrong, but I overwhelmed myself. Like every semester I was teaching different courses, because I got really excited that the statisticians would be like, hey, you want to teach this course? Sure. You know, I learned R through teaching a course that way. I learned all sorts of great stuff and got to play around with things. But yeah, I mean, teaching new courses all the time is my advice is do not do that. Find a few that you really like and you do, and stick with them for a while to kind of build your base before you start trying to do kind of crazy stuff out there with a bunch of other ones. And connect it to your research if you can. I mean, it really is important to think about that. That's your research to practice to some extent. Service, there's always more than you can do, and people will always give you service opportunities, as they like to call them. Here's a service opportunity. You start to come up with clever and polite ways to say no, like, oh, that seems like an awesome opportunity, but actually I have these 3 other things that I'm working on right now, and I just don't think that I can dedicate the time that would be necessary for that. Or, you know, maybe in another year. Always find out how much work the service actually requires, because sometimes you look at something and you're like, oh yeah, that doesn't seem like a lot of work. The next thing you know, you're doing like 40 hours a week for 3 weeks in spring, and you're like, what is this that's consuming my life? So service is one of the sneakiest, trickiest parts of being an academic, because it's so ill-defined and it can be so many different things, and people are always asking you to do it. So that's a really important one. And then mentorship. I had almost no mentorship at my institutions. Most of my mentors were external from my institutions. If you can find universities that have mentorship programs and ask about that, that's really important. It can be super supportive for you as you're going through it. I found my own mentors. I'm the type of person that will go out and do that, though. Not everybody is like that. And that can be really a struggle depending on your personality style too. If you're more of an introvert, you're probably not going to be the type of person that's like, oh, let me go find people to communicate with and interact with. Like, it's harder to do. And so having universities that have that built in structurally, it's huge. I mean, the people that I know that went through formal mentorship programs, the kind of support that they got is incredible. So look for that when you can. I was lucky that I had the personality that I would just go out and do it anyways, no matter what. And but that's me. And that's my privilege too, as being a white dude in academia, that I can just enter spaces and be accepted in them. Not everybody has that. So think through that, think through mentorship. Part of my mentorship came through fellowships too. So in math ed, we have the STAR Fellowship, which if you graduate and you get in an academic job as a math educator, do the STAR Fellowship. Game changer for me. The mentors that I now have because of that, the personal relationships I have with them, the things that I learned from them, I now collaborate with some of them. It was huge in shaping what I was able to do, and the connections that I had. But you still want institutional ones. You want people in your department that you could go to and be like, hey, you know, the department chair said this, do I need to do this thing? Or like the service thing came up, like, what's that like? How much research do I really need to be doing for tenure and promotion? You need people on the inside that can help give you kind of behind the scenes feedback and support in these things, and find multiple ones, because one person's opinion can be very different than another, and different people have different experiences. So I would always find multiple mentors, ask them the same question, see what responses I got, and triangulate. So there's the qualitative researcher side of me coming out, right? Of like, let me triangulate from different data sources what I want to do with this. That's really important. And policy documents too are something to always look at. Stay current. So you should be a lifelong learner as a PhD. Don't freeze like some of my colleagues did, because that's frustrating for other people that are around you too. How can you keep doing professional development? Every university offers this stuff. It's been huge for me. I took a huge professional development course on online teaching way before the pandemic, when I was like, I don't know if I really like online teaching. I don't know if this is really the thing. But my partner was like, no, you should do it. Like, try it. We'll see what happens with it. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and I was like, oh, crap. I kind of know what I'm doing now. This is good. This is actually really useful professional development I did. And so things like that, of like constantly like learning new ways of doing things. Keep up with reading. Like, you'll never be able to read as much as you do when you're a doctoral student. It's just the nature of the beast. But find spaces and time to read and reflect on things. Stay connected with your field. Still go to conferences. Still talk to people. Maybe not as frequently, but stay connected so that you kind of know what the new ideas are out there and what's going on with some of these things. And then always be aware of your tenure and promotion. That's what's going to guide you through this whole thing. You're beholden to those documents, know what they say, know what you have to do for them, and make sure that you're on track. You're getting feedback from annual reviews, third-year reviews, all that stuff. That's all important feedback to take into account and to think through as you're kind of moving through your institution. And then grants. It's a huge part of our productivity, right? And the thing I always tell people about grants is I go get money so I can pay teachers, because teachers need support, and that's what I want to do. So if I want to work with teachers, I need to be able to support them. And so I need to go get money for that. Now, yeah, it's great that I can pay myself sometimes too off that, but my number one goal always with grants is to support teachers, and they need money. And so that's what I kind of go for, and learn how to write grants. It's a specific genre of writing. It is not the same as writing a manuscript, and every grant agency is a little different on what they're looking for. Like, it's a whole own unique special thing. And think through, what kind of funding do you actually need to do what you want to do? I was analyzing textbooks when I did my dissertation. I needed $0. It was just time. But if I want to go work with teachers and work with a lot of teachers, then I need more money to be able to do those things. So how much money do I need to do the thing that I want to do, and who's got that kind of money and is willing to fund me for doing that kind of work? Start small. And then you start to build your identity. So like, I became an assistant professor, and I was at Appalachian State. I was still trying to figure out who I wanted to be, though. I didn't really know yet. Like, I didn't necessarily think I wanted to be a hardcore researcher, but then I started to realize, no, I really do. Like, I really like this part of the work. I really want to move more into this. And what activities do I want to spend my time doing? I started to realize I want to do more research than I'm doing of teaching. Like, I really love the teaching, but I don't have enough time to engage in the research the way that I want to, or the types of ways that I want to do that. And find your people. Who are your people for what you want to do and the topics that you engage in? For me, I'm an interdisciplinary person. So like, for my identity, I realized I'm a boundary crosser. And so that makes it hard sometimes to find your people. So you got to find other boundary crossers. And part of what I try to do now is create spaces for them at conferences and other places like that. I started to find that math ed doesn't always get me, and neither does stats ed. And that's part of the boundary crossing. And so I constantly have to explain different aspects of who I am and what I do to different communities because of that. But I really want to support teachers. And that was part of my identity, is I really want to support teachers. And that's what I want to spend my time doing, is how do I spend my time in schools doing that kind of work? But I want it to be rigorous educational research. Like, I want to make sure that it's impactful, that it's going to lead to change. And those were things that became important for me, and were things that were important that I spent my time kind of doing. And that's why I realized I needed to apply for a job again to get to a research intensive institution. And two, personally, I needed to get closer to my partner. And so these were both reasons why I started to apply again. I had to update everything because I had a new scholarly identity. I had new products that I'd done. I have a slightly more refined trajectory as to what I'm doing. All those things needed to be changed, except maybe my teaching philosophy. That was still pretty true. And then I had to consider, all right, if I'm going to leave this job in this place, what is it that I really want? And I need to apply to just the places that can provide that thing for me. I don't need to go around to everywhere because I'm like, I just need a job. Now it's like, I need a job that's going to better fit what I want. And what jobs will do that? What are the things that I want in a job? And so it's a different kind of job search that I engaged in my second time around when I was thinking about these things. Now, I'd still encourage you to do that the first time around. Like, if you look at this thing and you're like, this is all teaching, 4-4 load, I'm never going to do any research, and I really like research, it's probably not the job you want to try to apply for. Unless you're like regionally bound and you're like, I need a job, period. And if this is the only one, that's it. But you want to try to find something that's going to be a good fit, because otherwise you're going to be miserable. And you don't, that's not a good work-life balance. So my second round, I applied to 16 different jobs. I got only 3 phone interviews, 2 campus interviews, and 0 job offers. So I remained where I was for yet another round. But I got to network with a lot of people. I met all these people on these hiring committees that now I know and I get to wave to and say hi at conferences. So that was kind of nice. And then I went on round 2 and I opened up the gates and applied to 30 different jobs about. Got 7 phone interviews this time. I really upped my research productivity. I got 5 campus interviews, which is its whole own like fun experience of flying around to different campuses and trying to figure out what's going on there. I got 1 job offer, which I declined. And then the job that I'm currently in, I ended up being a partner hire. So I had applied to the position, but was not a campus interview finalist, but my wife was. And as part of her negotiation process, she got me hired on as an assistant professor. And so it worked out well for me. So I've now earned the title of what they refer to as trailing spouse. But it's been hugely helpful in where we're at, in that most people don't know that. I'm very open about it because it doesn't matter to me. I go out and do my research just the way that anybody else does, right? It doesn't really make a difference. But sometimes people take that as a stigma. And sometimes people, if your partner is in academia, don't realize that this is a thing that you can do. It is. There are partner hire opportunities out there. There's a lot of negotiation that goes on, which is, I mean, you could go, I could do a whole 2-hour presentation just on negotiating with institutions. It's a whole other thing that you have to do. Being a boundary crosser is not a bad thing. It can be good, but you have to find an institution that supports you in doing that kind of work. And UMass Dartmouth was always that institution for me, but other institutions might not be like that for you. And so looking for those spaces. So here I am. I'm at the University of Houston now, teaching, still valued here. We have the most diverse student population I've ever seen. It is not unusual for me to teach an undergrad class where I am the only white person in the room. I enjoy being in that space. It's nice being at an R1 institution, but it's a new R1. So that's a little different than a well-established R1. And I've started to realize that, and when you get into the day-to-day nitty-gritties of how things are run, sometimes people don't always know how those things function in the same way. So I went back to my job fit. All right, so this was a good fit on all the things that weren't a good fit at my previous institution, but then I learned there's new things that I want in a job that I didn't realize that I wanted because I had them at the previous one and didn't even think about it. One was their expectations. I found at my current institution, it's not super clear what my research expectations are. It's kind of phrased as go do good work. It's like, all right, cool. Like, how much of that are you looking for? Like, give me a sense here. I also learned that doctoral education is really important to me. I didn't interact with doctoral students at Appalachian State because we didn't have any. Now I get to interact with them a lot. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I went to a conference on that. I'm helping edit a collection of papers on that now. Like, that's become a thing that's important to me. And so one of the things that opened me up to is realizing that our doctoral program here is very young and there's a lot of issues. And so that becomes a thing that is constantly like, okay, well, how do we make this better? This is a thing that I struggle with a lot of times. And then something that I lost that I didn't realize how important it was to me is now I'm in a college of education, and there's only 2 other math educators. Well, one I'm married to, so like, yeah, I get to talk to her all the time, but she does elementary math ed, so we think about things very differently. And then there's one other person outside of that. And so I really lost my connection to my content area because I'm not in a content department anymore. And where I am currently, the Department of Mathematics does not value me or my work. And so I can't connect with them in the same way that I could when I lived in that department and I was in a place that valued that. And so these are things that I've learned through this transition that I miss now, that I want. And so these are things to think through in your job fit of like, how connected do you want to be to your content area? How important is it to work with doctoral students or not? How important are clear expectations or not? These are things that you start to think through in terms of that job fit and what you want as you're kind of moving into those spaces. My work-life balance, because my job description is vague, is often overwhelming because of that, because I don't know how much I'm supposed to do at any given time sometimes. My service here is very different because we have this funny thing of we nominate each other for service committees, where my previous institution, the department chair just divvied things up equitably. So you get this email like once a year that, congratulations, you've been nominated for all this service. And you're kind of like, oh, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Now I realize it's a bad thing. And it's like, well, I'm going to deny a lot of these nominations and just do this one. But it's a whole new way of interacting around those things that we've had to learn in being here. The location is really good, but there's not really a work-life divide for me here. Like, my work bleeds into my life frequently. And so I have to find ways of protecting my life from work at times. And then too, like, my work-life balance has been completely reshaped because my wife and I had a baby this past summer. And so that's a whole experience that shapes what you're able to do and how you interact as an academic. And so it's severely diminished my productivity. I will say that. That's not a bad thing, right? But it is a reality. Like, I do not have as much time to engage in research as I used to because I'm spending more time at home. And so that's a thing to think about too when you're thinking about jobs, is like, how much time do I really have to work and dedicate to these things? And how much time do I want to spend at home with my family doing other things? And that's an important thing for you to think through when you're trying to decide these things. Research intensive jobs can sometimes lead to unhealthy work balances, potentially. They don't have to. It really just depends on how clear the expectations are and what they are at the different institutions that are out there. So I get a lot of support for research here. I get startup funds. I get a research office that knows what they're doing to submit grants, to do budgets for me. That's a huge thing. And because of all of that, I've been able to get grants, which I could not really do at my previous institution. I got little things here and there, but not much. I get professional development specifically on research, on how to do it, how to write grants. I get to work with doctoral students as research assistantships, which now I got somebody working 20 hours a week for me. Well, that hugely increases my research productivity, right? I mean, versus me just working by myself at my previous institution. And so that changes very much what I'm able to do productivity-wise and output-wise. And so that's, of course, increased the number of manuscripts I can get out in a year and all those things. So I was able to get 2 grants since I've been here. And a lot of that is because of the support that I get for grant writing. So when I first transitioned over, I was starting to work on these, and my first career grant attempt got not awarded, and got really good feedback that was helpful to me. And then I was co-PI on an IUS grant, which did get funded, and we're still working on that. And it's been a lot of fun to learn through that and to work with other folks. And then I did a second career grant submission, and that one was funded. And so that's what consumes a lot of my time now. And, you know, part of the reason I applied for a career grant was because I'd had advisors that had them and saw how much of an impact it was. I'd worked on Chandra's career grant. Shaknosa got hers, I think, right as I was leaving, but I was there when she was working on developing that, and hearing those things about what kind of support that provides and space to do the work that you want to do has been huge. And it opens doors that you don't realize were out there to even open sometimes. And so, yes, it is somewhat of an elitist perspective of, you have these unique grants that kind of do that. But at the same time, it is helpful if that's a thing that's really helpful for you of a career grant. for me, because I'm a boundary crosser, I don't have a lot of people to collaborate with because there's not a lot of people that are interested in studying the specific things that I study. And so a career grant was a really good fit for me because then I could uniquely kind of focus on those things. But some people prefer to collaborate, would much rather have a larger team to collaborate with. That's totally fine if that's what you want to do. And that's part of that researcher identity, that scholarly identity. Now, since then, I do collaborate with a lot more people, and I think it's partially because the doors that the career grant opened for me to connect with different scholars that I didn't have opportunities to connect with before. Something you learn really quickly in academia is there's a lot of elitism out there. I have been turned down for job offers because of the name of the institution on my degree, because it didn't come from one of the top 6, math ed or research production institutions like Harvard or MIT or things like that. It's garbage. It doesn't, it's a dumb perspective that is out there, but it's out there. So it's something to be aware of. And so the places that I've ended up being and inhabiting are the places that respect the kind of work that I do and the scrappiness that I bring to that work. And I think that's really important to think about when you're looking at those things. Service where I'm at. Yeah. So, I mean, I get nominated for service. I get to do all sorts of stuff. And some things that have set off alarm bells for me here is I've been asked to do service that really shouldn't be done by people that don't have tenure yet. And so that's something to always think about when you're at a place. Like, what are they making me do for service? And is it really appropriate for where I'm at in my level? And if it's not, then why am I being asked to be doing so much service? Teaching is a little different here. So I get to teach a wide array of courses. I get to connect it to my research, and I'm teaching methods courses now. So this was a huge shift from teaching content courses for me. And in some ways I like it, and in some ways I don't. So that's something to think about too when you're picking an institution is what kind of courses do you want to teach? Do you really want to teach content, or do you want to teach people how to teach? Those are different places that you want to live based on that kind of coursework that you want to do. And this helped me develop my identity even more. Like, I really have started to aim more towards systemic change. So I work more in policy work now. I spend time looking at standards and helping write standards in states, thinking about how do I write things that policy holders and makers are going to pay attention to, but also working with more and more different organizations that connect in different ways that are going to allow me to network to build systemic change. So working with curriculum developers or working with nonprofits. That has become more and more important to me because I can run around and do a bunch of stuff by myself, but it's not going to be nearly as impactful as if I can build a network of people to work together on these things and build spaces systemically to sustain them in the long run. And data science has increasingly become a part of what I do, just because that's the changing nature of the field. And so that's part of that staying current. Stay current with what your field is and understand what the shifts are in the winds. For me, data science is actually basically what I describe statistics as, but if I got to call it something different so people understand what I'm doing, then that's fine with me. And so it's, sometimes it's as simple as a name change to better identify yourself and what you're doing. So that's a very long way of describing my story through where I'm at currently. And this was a story that will continue on and on and on, I'm sure. But yeah, I've been rambling on for a really long time. So I'd love to hear if folks have questions or want to dialogue about things.
Sure. I have a question about you mentioned service, and I guess I hadn't really thought of that before as one of those 3 buckets. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, is that generally an expectation, or is that unique to some of the places you've been?
No, service is an expectation for pretty much any job. So there are different classifications of faculty. So like where I'm at, we have tenure track faculty. And so our workload distribution is 40% research, 40% teaching, 20% service. We also have what we refer to as clinical faculty, but other institutions, maybe they're called lecturers or instructional faculty, things like that. They are 80% teaching and 20% service. There is no designation that does not involve service. We have some research scientists that only do research, but they're all soft money funded, and I don't usually see any of them. So they're kind of a special breed, but usually any academic job is going to involve that service, and that can mean a lot of different stuff. So the general buckets they say is you got to serve your department, which is basically like your department needs things done to operate. And so that's part of what your service to the department is. So committees to do this, that, and the other thing. your college needs that, your university needs that, but then also your field. So things like reviewing manuscripts, reviewing for conferences, for funding agencies, serving on committees for different organizations, that's all service to your field. And then service to your community is also typically a part of that. Oftentimes it's associated to your expertise. So I often give free professional development in schools, and that's service of what I'm doing. And so that's another way that service bucket is kind of filled. So that's why it can become so all-consuming, is because it's somewhat nebulous and it can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different places, and there's a lot of different levels to it to serve as well. But yeah, it is always a part, and it's one of those things that you don't necessarily think about until you're like in the field, and then those are your job expectations.
Travis, there's a question for you in the comments from Dave.
Where was it?
It says from Kim Welty. I assume it's from Dave.
It is.
It
It is. So Travis, being a physical science teacher, both chemistry and physics, I've had no math education instruction besides the little I did with you in that master's course. And I repeatedly have to teach the math before the math teachers get to it. And I just feel like I'm not doing a good enough job. It's subtle, but there's different perspectives between the way a science teaches a math and the way a mathematician did. And any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because it's something it's kind of an outcome of our perverse way of siloing the disciplines, especially at the high school level, right? And so
Yeah.
I remember when I was a high school teacher, we would run into the same thing. The science teachers would be like, y'all aren't teaching them any math. And we're like, well, what math are you talking about? And they'd show us, and we're like, oh yeah, well, that doesn't come in until 10th grade, and you have 9th graders. And it's like, well, maybe the standards should be better aligned across the disciplines like that. It's a huge challenge because of that. I remember in Massachusetts with the Coast Project, one of the challenges we had was that some teachers, because their contract says they don't have to consider other disciplines. And so like finding time to make them think through like the interconnectivity wasn't in their contract. And so it was kind of like, oh, do I want to spend my time doing this? Now, most of the math teachers there are used to connecting. And so, and most of the people on that grant were great, but they would talk about their colleagues. Sometimes it was a struggle to get them on board with some of those things, which is a challenge, right? You know, your math is more of what it started as, right? It's applied. Here's a problem that we're trying to figure out, and we need to use mathematics as a tool to help us figure it out. You're modeling all the time. Some of the best researchers I've seen that live in that space, Rich Lear was one of them. I mean, he was math and science he kind of just like, he played with all those ideas across that. But one of his graduates, who's a good friend of mine, Seth Jones, who's at Middle Tennessee State, has a career grant, and the entire career grant is working with middle school math and science teachers to actually write curriculum across their standards, because they're trying to deal with that issue that you described of, well, you're doing this topic over here at a different time of this topic. How can we meld these things together so that we're learning them in unison? So it's actually teaching one subject is supporting the teaching of the other subject. He's early on with that, so I don't know what he's learned. But yeah, I mean, I think part of it too is just, you know, connect with your math teachers and see if they're willing to talk with you and talk through some of those things. Because I think that's really important to think about those connections and across the disciplines. I mean, we experience the same thing in academia. For me to go work with somebody in a math department is like a colossal pain, because we're different administrative units. And so then, well, where does the funding flow and who's in charge of what and what are your, I mean, it's like the biggest, stupidest pain in the butt. But it's a reality of the institutional structures that we have. But yeah, I mean, I would say go find math folks that want to talk and play nice with you, and form relationships with them on like, hey, I'm trying to do this, but like, how do you all teach it, or when do you teach it, or are there better ways that I could be doing this?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to chime in here, but I think you pointed out to a bigger systemic problem, because even the ways in which we teach math, or where we teach math and where we teach science at the high school level, it's not uniform, right? Like, for instance, I remember my kids were taking AP Physics as a freshman, right? But then that AP Physics required certain level of algebra and certain level of calculus that they didn't see it yet. right? Like physics, there's a physics that's based on algebra, and there's physics that's based on calculus. And to me, like chemistry is so much of it is math. Or even right now biology, right? To be able to understand certain evolutionary concepts, or the what we've been talking about for now multiple years about the COVID, understand everything that we talk publicly about how COVID spreads and so on. All of it has the basis in math, and then mathematical calculations and science.
Yeah, it's a perennial problem in the way that we've designed schooling here, honestly. Like, instead of focusing in on problems that we develop across the curriculum, I mean, like somebody was asking about STEAM, same type idea, right? Like, how do we actually start to do things across these disciplinary boundaries? I mean, that's what STEM is supposed to be too. More often than not, my experiences with those things are, though, is it's like, we call it STEM, but really we're doing S&M, or we call it STEAM, but we're doing A&M. It's like, well, we'll pick a couple letters, but because it's interdisciplinary, we'll use the bigger umbrella. So like, actually finding places where they're truly like doing those things, I find are very few. And like Shagnosa, you pointed out Walter's work. I mean, Walter developed the whole teach program around that mentality of like bridging between those two, which has been replicated a lot of places, though in my experience, some places have replicated it better than others. We have a replicate here and it's very isolated, so it actually doesn't end up doing the kind of connectivity that you'd want it to. But yeah, I mean, building those kind of spaces is really, really hard to do. And I increasingly am starting to communicate with social studies ed people because I'm so adamant about teaching statistics through investigating sociopolitical issues. Well, social studies teachers deal with sociopolitical issues all the time. I mean, that's like their thing. And so they have far more expertise a lot of times in the types of things that we engage in. And so collaborating with them has been interesting, and hearing how they talk about things differently.
Collins is next.
Oh yeah, thank you, Dr. Weiland, for the presentation. You've laid out things the way they actually are on the ground, and this has been very invaluable. So you mentioned taking time to think and I'd say strategize. Now, as you've been doing this, are there particular moments you remember that you've had those light bulb moments, and something that you'd like to share about that?
Yeah, so one of the ways that I've found space to think is physical activity. Go on hikes, walk the dog, take the canoe out, things like that. Those were kind of spaces that were easy because then I was kind of like physically engaging in something, but I could keep my mind and kind of wander and think about things. Honestly, some of my best thoughts have come up in the middle of the night, and then they haunt me, and then I have to get up and start working and I don't sleep. So that's another way that sometimes those things come up, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I found this with a lot of academics I've talked to, of like, you wake up at like 3 in the morning and then all of a sudden you have a light bulb moment, and it's like, well, crap, I'm not going back to sleep now. I might as well sit down and start writing, or let me draft this out. It happens a lot. And the more you think about it, the more you're thinking about, the more it starts to crop up in your thoughts in other places. Sometimes it's as simple as like, I'm sitting down eating dinner, or in my instance, it's unique because my wife also works in math ed. She does very different work than I do. So, like our dinner conversations are sharing math ed stuff sometimes. So we end up thinking about things at times that, a lot of people don't, just because that's part of our personal relationship, right? But yeah, like walks and hikes were some of the most helpful times for me to let my mind wander without constraints. Because the other thing too was I didn't have internet access at my fingertips. I wasn't like distracted by other things. I was literally just physically in a space, letting my mind wander. And those have always been some of the times that were most helpful for me to just think and reflect.
All right, thank you. Thank you also for the way you've not shied away or to talk about things that other people would have tiptoed.
Yeah, I'm very blunt, so y'all can ask any questions you want. Like I'm very transparent. Some people find that off-putting and some people enjoy it, but yeah, I'm always happy to answer pretty much any question about anything.
It's been helpful.
Excellent. Rohini is up next.
Hello, Travis. So nice to hear from you. I've heard about you so much before in our meetings with Dr. Oral. I was really interested in kind of what you touched upon before about inclusion courses that you were a part of. And I believe you said it was in the Appalachian or something. I don't know if it was in that area. Well, I was kind of wondering if that's something that was in the program, how your experience was in the inclusion courses, considering I don't think there's a lot of diversity there, but that could be my lack of experience. I was wondering how that was a part of the course, or if, how your experience was and what kind of courses, were included in the inclusion courses.
Yeah, so the term inclusion we use is a specific designation for when you have a certain proportion of your students have individualized education plans, which is kind of like a federal government designation. So typically, like they used to use the terminology kind of disabilities or special education. I usually stay away from more of that, and it's more like the students that have personalized needs or different abilities. And so in those courses, I would have a special education teacher assigned to me as well. So I would have to co-teach with them. The students would get pulled out frequently for other supports. Now, in terms of like inclusivity, like diversity, now racial diversity, we did not have much of. It's a very white area with a growing Hispanic population or Latinx population. They mostly identified as Hispanic. And most of that's through farming. Where that was coming from. But I mean, I remember an experience in one of my classes where I would ask my students, students that were Spanish speaking, what country did you immigrate here from, or what country is the native country of your parents? And I had one of my white students that had lived in the mountains his entire life go, everybody that speaks Spanish comes from Mexico. And I was like, all right, we're gonna have a geography lesson now, because that is patently false. And let's unpack that a little bit. But most of what we mean by inclusion with that is the special education side. And so sometimes those students would have modifications, extended time, a lot of different kind of special needs. And eventually I would often get some of the students that just had psychological kind of traumas that they were dealing with in my class. And so, sometimes it was like, we needed to seat this person in this part of the room so that they would feel safe in that space, or certain students needed to be a certain distance from one another. So all sorts of things that you have to start to consider that have not really anything to do with the content, but are an important part of the teaching of the fact that you're interacting with people. And when people interact, then there's different things that you have to accommodate in those interactions. So that's more of what that inclusion term was used for when I was a high school teacher.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really interested, but good to know. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
So Travis, in the comments a little bit ago, Beth asked a question that you've sort of touched on, but I wanted to circle back to make sure you don't have more to say to it, which was, what's your experience with STEAM? Do you see it as a growing interdisciplinary education pathway to ignite learning, excitement, and interest in younger students?
I don't see STEAM much coming up in academia. Where I see STEAM more often is usually in nonprofits, in specialized schools, things like that. I think it has a lot of potential, but it's similar to STEM. It's a catchy name that's meant to be more inclusive, but the way it's often enacted falls on its face. So I think it's got potential, and I think there are places that do really good work with it. There are certainly some academics out there that are doing work with that. Most of the people I know that do STEAM work usually do it outside of school settings. So they'll work with like different museums, or different like after school programs, things like that, because they have flexibility to kind of do what they want in those spaces. And so they don't have to deal with all these institutional silos like we have in K-12 schools. So I do think it has potential. I mean, even in data science, one of the things that I've started to see is connections between art and data science, and thinking about like, how do you visualize data in really interesting artistic ways. I've started working with some data journalists, and I mean, that's something they work with graphic designers all the time in their data visualizations, because they want them to be catchy and they want them to be colorful and interactive and engaging in different ways. So I do think there's space there for that, and I do think that it's an area that people are interested in. I do think it's an area that NSF is interested in funding things in. I think it's a real challenge in finding spaces that enable you to do that and don't obstruct you from doing that.
Great. Yeah, so Beth notes that surprises her because there's been, so many years of researching and the walls are still there. Yeah, schools are super hard to change, Beth.
Yes.
I'm going to jump in real quick on this one. So being chemistry, I have to deal with what can't be seen. So I try to get as much art in as I can, and with my modeling and trying to understand how the students are visualizing. So I am having some luck with STEAM. And I'm also able to connect with some diverse students who have math deficiencies or other things, and the art has been engaging. So yeah, but Travis, you're right. I haven't seen anything recently. And it's just because I'm an old dog and can't learn new tricks.
Well, and the really sad thing about schooling right now, so I teach our method students and they're out in the field student teaching at the same time that I have them. And most of them have been born after No Child Left Behind. And their reality, their lived experience of mathematics has almost always been driven by standardized testing. And they don't know that there exists something else of that. And that drives so much of what happens in the schools now. I mean, some schools have gotten so hyper standardized, they're scripting their teachers. They're taking like the Engage and Y curriculum that's got vignettes of how that are meant to basically show you, oh, this is maybe how this might look in a classroom. And they're saying, and the district people are saying, you're going to read this as a script. And just to, it's like, no, that's not what that's made for. You should not be scripting teaching, because that means you're totally not responsive to your students, which is one of the most important parts of teaching. And so it's a huge issue that we have, that in mathematics in particular. Science, y'all are somewhat sheltered from this because you're not like, you don't get standardized tested to death like we do in mathematics. But I mean, most of my teachers, when they go out in the field, like, they're like, well, I have to take some sort of assessment every Friday with my students so we can see where they're progressing towards the standardized assessment. And it's like, well, first off, the standardized assessment is garbage. It's a terrible measure of anything. And then you're using a bunch of other really crappy measures on a weekly basis to tell you how well you're progressing towards this end goal crappy measure. And so it just kills the ability to like cross collaborate, because they're like, well, we don't see any test items on STEAM on the test, so we're not going to spend time on that. I experience that because statistics doesn't often get tested. Even if it's in the standards, it's very rarely ending up on standardized assessments. And if it does, if you actually read the question, it's usually some plug and chug thing where they give you like a margin of error formula and some numbers to throw into it. And so I look at it and I'm like, that's a proportional reasoning problem or an algebra problem. That's not a statistics problem. And so the standardized tests drive so much of what happens in schools. It really makes it hard to make it so that you can bring new ideas into the classroom because of that. That's why I work in standards as much as I do now, was because of that reality of like, if it's not in the standards, then, and it's not assessed, then it's just, it has no value all of a sudden educationally, even though it really should.
So Ali has a question.
Thank you. Because of my own experience with computer science, now I'm working towards like computational thinking and computer science education. I would like to ask you about data science education. And what do you think will be the implication of this kind of education for K-12 education in future? Because we were last time talking to Dr. Yasmin Kafai, and she was talking about computational thinking 3.0, which is more focused on the data analysis aspects and like machine learning.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's kind of like the wild, wild west. Everybody's trying to grab some space and define what it is because it's so ill-defined. I mean, data science itself, if you go asking data scientists what data science is, everyone you ask is going to give you a different response. And part of it depends on where they come from. So you have, there's a lot of data science that's driven by business, right? Because you have like these data analytics, and that's going to make us more profit. Google, Amazon, all those folks are using that stuff and have been for years. And so they're driven by very different models of what data science should be and what you're doing with them than people that are like data journalists that are doing it, or people that were really statisticians but really hated the fact that statistics wouldn't move forward into thinking about using computers in savvy ways and wanted to just keep driving their way through hypothesis testing, even though it's really stupid when you can simulate stuff. So depending on where those people come from, they have different kind of agendas and goals. And so that's what's happening in data science education. Some things are cropping out of math ed because that's where statistics is. And that's where people are thinking that, well, we'll pull it off as statistics because that already exists. But then there's the computer science side of it too. So Virginia has developed standards that are computer science standards, and that's where their data science courses live. Whereas other states are doing it in their mathematics standards. And so right now it's really up in the air as to how that develops. I mean, there's advantages to being math because math is always going to be there, right? Like it's like one of the core disciplines. And so that if you tie yourself to math, it gives you somewhat of a perspective, a protected space, versus computer science has always had to fight for space in the curriculum for K-12. And still has to fight for that space, even though it's one of the more relevant topics you can learn. And so there's a lot of different arguments based on that of like, you know, which trailer do we hitch ourselves to that's going to kind of get it in there. And then some math ed folks are starting to think through, well, how do we use this for computational thinking, but how do we infuse this into our already existing classes? So we're teaching algebra with data science, right? And so we can program the things that we do in algebra through R and learn a programming language and also do the data analysis side of it too. So there's thoughts about that aspect of it as well that I think there's a lot of space for. I mean, computational thinking is a really important area right now for all the STEMs, the STEAM, like, right? That's a huge part of it. And then AI is going to push this even farther, right? I mean, like teachers right now are freaking out about kids cheating with Chat GPT, right? And it's like, that's the tip of the iceberg, folks, like that, you know. And also too, it makes me start to go, I mean, if a computer can do this job for us, then why are we training people how to do it? Do we still need to train people how to do some of these things? Like I think about in mathematics, some of the topics that have died over the years. You know, we used to be obsessed with rationalizing the denominator because we didn't have calculators, so we had tables. And you'd have to look up in the table what the value of this thing was. And so you had to rationalize the denominator to find it in the table. Well, we don't need to do that anymore. We have calculators that are going to do this for us. So why are we spending time rationalizing this denominator anymore? And so it's this idea of like the curriculum is really hard to change and really slow to change. And so finding spaces for that really important stuff like computational thinking and computer science have been really, really slow to really see a broader fruition in the curriculum because of that. But I think it's a thing that's deeply tied in there. Somebody who does a lot of work with that at Berkeley is Michelle Wilkerson. I think she technically identifies as science ed, but her whole thing is computational thinking and data science education. And she's been doing a whole project with, he was middle grade science students over writing data stories. And they were usually doing kind of environmental, sociopolitical type issues with that. So it's really important. I mean, computer science is a huge area that's super untapped in a lot of the STEM right now, and tapping that into also the technology side of science teaching, right? The technology and the engineering aspects that are in there. That's a huge part of it. So, I mean, you have an easy space to build from. There's not a lot of people that work in that space, unfortunately. And it's going to be super crucial. But yeah, I mean, data science is, I think because business likes it so much, it's become super hot and sexy to do. And so everybody wants to do data science and all the funders want to give money to it, even though they don't really know what it is, but like everybody seems to be talking about it. So we should probably spend money on it. So it's created spaces for people to do really meaningful things that didn't have funding before, but it's also created spaces for people to come in that really don't know what the hell they're doing and start to try to like take up space doing things. But it's a really interesting cross-disciplinary space. I see art educators in there. I see social studies educators in there, computer science educators. It's kind of shed the disciplinary boundaries because it hasn't been defined yet. And so there's a lot of space to kind of create it the way you want it to right now. Yeah, that was probably a really rambly answer to your question too. I'm sorry.
No. I really liked your answer, and it has opened up like new dimensions for me. And thank you very much for shedding light on this.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question.
So do we have any other questions for Travis? He's giving you a ton of information. Go ahead, Hamza.
Thank you. First of all, good to see you, Travis.
Good to see you too. It's been a while.
It's been a while, yeah. I hope we see each other soon in one of the conferences coming up. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this information. So I'm at that stage where trying to balance job applications and dissertation and all that. So this information is like gold right now. So thank you, first of all. The other thing is, I know you have talked a little bit about interviews, like the phone interviews or the on-campus interviews. If you want to talk a little bit more about how those are structured or what to expect, so that will be something helpful.
Yeah, happy to. I actually do presentations on that with our doctoral students here in Houston. So phone interviews are usually pretty quick and short. They're trying to narrow down their list. If you've gotten a phone interview, they like you, they're interested in what you have, but they have to narrow down their list further. And so this is an opportunity to start to hear more about that. They're usually like 30 minutes, maybe, and I've had some that are as long as an hour, but usually it's about 30 minutes. Usually we do them over Zoom now. I mean, I used to do them over phone. I had a really terrible phone one time where everybody phoned into this thing and nobody knew who was in there. It was a disaster, but it's usually Zoom. And so you can see the people, which is nice to put a face with a name in that interaction. And they're going to ask questions usually about your fit with the position. So they might ask you, like, how do you see yourself fitting in here at this institution? Where do you see your research going in the next 5 years? What's something that attracted you to this job posting? Things like that, to get a better sense of you and to get information beyond just what a cover letter can sometimes convey. And two, like, people write cover letters in different ways. And so the interview gives you a way to kind of systematically ask questions, but then there's also always space at the end for you to ask questions. And I would advise have some questions ready, because that shows that you are done your homework and you're engaged in that particular institution. So before I go into a phone interview, I always look up, if I know the people that are going to be on the interview, I look them up. I want to see, who are these people? What's their specialization? What do they do? So I have a sense of who they are. And I also want to look up the institution. So what kind of programs might I be teaching in? What kind of courses might I be teaching in? What kind of research has already been done there? Things like that. Like, I want to have a sense of that institution. And so then I usually prepare a few questions. And I usually end always with the question of, like, where does the process go from here, to get some sense, because then sometimes they'll tell you, oh yeah, so we're going to, review this, and then in 2 weeks, we're going to start to reach out to people. So that gives you some sense of timeline, or how that it's going to progress, which they don't always volunteer, but if you ask for it, they'll typically tell you. And so that gives you some more insight into how things are going to go. But yeah, that's usually the phone interview side. Campus interview is an endurance race. I did one recently that was 2.5 days of 12-hour days. It was, so you're just like exhausted because you're constantly engaging with people on a very high level. So my suggestions usually with campus interviews are, if you're an introverted person, prepare yourself for it, because that's going to be really tough for you to be engaging with so many different people all the time like that. I'm more extroverted, so it still tires me, just because that level of engagement is going to tire anybody, but I can play off a crowd pretty easily. So that makes it a lot easier for me to walk into a room and just kind of roll with things. If you're not that kind of person, then you're going to want to prep more to be able to, like, answer questions and be prepared to kind of engage in dialogue constantly. They take you out to meals, so that's more informal space to kind of meet people and talk, but it's still a chance for you to ask a lot of questions. A campus interview is you interviewing the institution as much as they're interviewing you, because you want to try to suss out, is this thing a good fit? Something that I've learned over the years too is that every institution has things that are really messed up. If I can start to suss out what those are on an interview, it's going to help me understand if that's going to be a good fit for me, or if this place is like a dumpster fire in hiding and I need to stay away. Because there are places that are like that. You never know what the internal politics are sometimes. Now, you can talk to people. The more people you know in the field, the more you can be like, hey, so what about this place? And I've had some people like, and they're like, you don't want to go there, like, steer clear. And so that's helpful stuff, but sometimes you don't get that. And so starting to try to, like, pinpoint, all right, what are going to be the issues here? Do all the people get along? Do the faculty seem to get along here? Do they seem to be cordial with one another? Or are they, like, in competition with one another? Visions. Does everybody have the same kind of goal and visions here? And by that, I mean, like, is the faculty thinking of the same direction as the department chair, as the dean, like, or people all over the place on what they think they're supposed to be doing and where the things are supposed to go. And you get the schedule ahead of time. One of the things that I do, actually my wife taught this trick to me, is we create Google slideshows. And what we do in those is every single person we're going to meet has a slide. We put their picture on it, and then we write down, all right, who is this person and what are some things I should know about them? Like, you know, sometimes where they got their doctorate is a conversation point that you can touch off of, or what is it that they're in charge of? Like, I recently met some admins that were like associate provost of blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, I don't even know what the hell that is. So I have to figure out, like, what is this person's role actually, so I can figure out what questions I might ask them. And that's usually my next slide. Is first is who's the person and what are some things about them? And then what questions do I want to ask this person, so that I'm prepared to do that. Because sometimes you'll go into these conversations and they have questions for you, but more often than not, they're going to give you a little quick spiel and they're going to say, what questions do you have for me? And though how you ask those questions helps inform them just as much as it helps inform you. Because if you have good questions, they can see you're engaged, you kind of know how things work, you're trying to figure out if this is a good fit or not. They want to see you asking questions. So the only time it's okay to say I don't have any more questions is often like meals at the end of the day, when people are like, do you have any more questions? And it's like, not right now, but I might email you. Because it's, and everybody knows, they've been through it themselves. You're exhausted, right? You've had information overload throughout the entire day. But when you meet with those admins, when you meet with faculty, ask them questions. And I often ask the same question to a lot of different people. So, you know, what are the research expectations? I want to ask everybody that, because I want to know, does the dean have the same research expectations, the department chair, as someone else? All that stuff is important. You want to, I mean, you want to leave a good impression, because at the end of the day, that's what they're going to make their decisions off of, is how well do you fit in the department, and are you going to fit in well with this group of people? When I was a tenure track person at my first institution, one of the older full professors told me, they're like, listen, it's really important to be on hiring committees, because when you're hiring somebody, you want to make sure they're not an asshole, because if they get tenured, you might be stuck with that asshole for the next 30 to 40 years, and you might not want to have to do that. And I was like, huh, it's a very interesting perspective in how you phrase that, but I totally get what you mean, right? Like, is this person going to be collegial? Because just because you're not going to be teaching the same classes, you're going to end up on service committees together. You're going to be voting on things as a department. Are you going to be fighting this person the whole time when you're trying to decide things and grow programs, or are you going to be collaborating with this person and working with them? I mean, that's some of the stuff for campus interviews. I mean, the other stuff I say is always like, don't eat heavy at meals, because that'll tank you. Keep your energy up. I bring granola bars and water with me so that, like, I can have snacks. You know, take those bathroom breaks, and sometimes I'll run through my slides and use it as like a breather to, like, because you're constantly being shuttled around to people when you're doing those things. And the other thing with those campus interviews too is, like, they should be putting their best foot forward. I mean, I remember, Chandra, you telling me a story of one of your interviews. If they're not showing you a good time, then they're not going to get more cordial to you after you're there. Like, this is them trying to convince you to come. And ask tough questions too. Like, really dig into, what is this place and how does it function and what are the problems here? And some people are going to give you a fairy tale, and some people are going to answer very honestly, but you can usually get a decent read of that. And the more people you ask those questions to, the better read that you get on those things. And talk to the students, because the students will have different perspectives than the faculty. Sometimes you'll have that built in, like sometimes you have to teach a class, sometimes you have your own time to just sit with students. Like, oftentimes at like a doctoral place, you'll meet with the doc students. And you'll get to talk with them, but ask them what they think, how it works for them. What are they interested in? How do they like the faculty? How do they like the program? What brought them here and what keeps them here? Those are different institutional perspectives than what you're going to get from faculty, that might uncover different issues that the faculty aren't even aware of themselves in some of those things. And so that's a really interesting thing to think through. And then after the campus interview, there's the negotiation process. And the biggest thing I'll say with that is, always negotiate. Never say yes right off the bat, and always think about, what do you really want, and ask for it, and give them reasons why. Because one thing I've learned over the years is that They can often give you more than what they first offer you if you really push them. And that's not going to make them they're not going to revoke an offer from you. Like, that's almost unheard of. There's some horror stories out there, but it's very rare. But always give yourself time to think through an offer and think about, is this enough for me? Is there more things that I need? And realistically, a lot of times, what do I need to be successful? And that's how I often frame it. Like, I need this much money so that I can do this kind of research so I can be successful towards tenure. They want you to be successful. So if you can frame it that way, or, I need to reduce teaching load so that I can do this, things like that, that can help you be successful in working towards tenure.
Thank you so much. I think this might be a kind of a connection here that you might be getting some emails from more questions sooner.
Yeah, anytime. I'm happy
So
to answer those.
just giving you a heads up here.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. Because this is all the stuff that it isn't in books. It isn't written down places. You don't learn it in class. It's really through talking to people. So I can tell you, like, some of this stuff I learned from the faculty there. A good bit of it I did. And so talking to your advisors, talking to faculty about experiences with jobs, but talking around is helpful too, because different people have had different experiences. Different people have different horror stories, right? And so it's really helpful to hear those things and to find out about that stuff.
No, definitely. And I think in our department here, we get all that kind of information and help from the advisors. But coming from you, someone who has been recently in the job market, has like opened up more information, like making sure that I'm not just preparing for an interview to answer that question, but also preparing those questions for you, something that I wasn't thinking about that strong. So I think that's really helpful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. And so I still dabble on the job market. Like, there are some years I haven't applied to things, but every once in a while, if something comes up, I'll apply to see. And part of it too is it helps me connect to other institutions, but also here's the sad reality of academia. One of the only ways to get a significant raise or to get your institution to give you more things is to get a job offer from somewhere else. And then be like, hey, so-and-so is going to hire me. What are you going to do to keep me? It's a pain in the butt because it's really a waste of time. A lot of times they could have just given you what you needed in the first place, but it is one of the realities of it. And two, like, I just find that, sometimes you don't realize what a different institution or a different opportunity might provide to you that you didn't think of before, that could be really useful for your career or move you into a location that's better for you. We all start off places because we need money after grad school, right? We need a job. And so sometimes it's like, okay, well, I'm here, but where I really want to end up is over here. And so what do I need to do to get there and keep my eye open? And maybe I need to jump multiple institutions to get there. One of my mentors, Beth Herbal-Eisenman, if you look at her CV, I think in the first 10 years of her career, she was at 6 or 7 different institutions. And I've talked to her a number of times, like, how did you know when you're at the right one? And for her, she always told me, she's like, it was the right fit. Like, I learned that I needed to have people that were engaging in scholarly conversations with me, but also really cared about teaching. And she said that took her a while to find a place that had that for her. And so she bounced around for a while. And some people do that. Some people stay at the same institution. They land a place and that's the place and that's where they stay. And there's nothing wrong with that either. It's just a matter of finding what's best for you.
And I think there's also, and I'm just having this conversation because I'm not seeing any hands coming up. So if any questions, I don't want to take all the time here. But one thing that I wanted to ask, and I didn't see that coming up in your conversation, is there is also this notion in academia, especially now that if you're looking for direct faculty position, that there is a postdoc kind of a requirement to get through if you're looking for that kind of position. So have you also felt that kind of a need, even if you have multiple years of experience teaching, that postdoc is kind of a thing coming up more frequent in a way?
Not in math ed. Mostly because there aren't that many postdoc positions out there in our field. It's pretty rare. So I've started to try to apply for funding for postdocs just because I'm finding the job market, the pandemic just crushed the job market for a while. Like this year, it bounced back pretty well. So this year's been pretty good. But there's a lot more people with PhDs out there than there are tenure track positions. And so I think you'll see more postdoc positions coming out, but in hiring conversations, I'm not hearing anybody saying we need to see people with postdocs. Now, one thing I will say is that if you want to be in a tenure track position and you're coming straight out of doc school, having a publication on your CV is super helpful, at least one. You definitely want conference proceedings and conference presentations, but having that publication out there will really help separate you from other folks. That is something I've seen, and that's something I was told when I was graduating as well. So this isn't like a new thing. This is a thing that's been around for a while now. And honestly, that's more of like, when I've been in hiring conversations, does this person clearly have a research trajectory? Like they know what they're going to do and they have an idea of how they're going to start doing that? Or are they just kind of wandering aimlessly and they don't really know what they want to do? They're going to need a lot of support. They don't really have a direction. Or sometimes you get folks where you're like, this person has really just been doing their advisor's work and they don't really have their own clear kind of perspective of what they're going to do. Those are really important things that we consider oftentimes on hiring, is that research trajectory. Like, do you clearly know what you want to study and have some ideas of how you want to start doing that? Now, you're not married to that. You don't have to do that for the rest of your career, but you have to have some idea of direction so that when you hit the ground there, you have something that you're starting to work towards. Having some grant experience doesn't hurt, but it's not a necessary thing. Having applied to like a conference travel grant, things like that, or things that work towards that, or you've worked on an NSF funded project, you have some sense of what that looks like, then those can be helpful. But yeah, I mean, there are so few postdocs out there. I mean, it's very rare I even come across the CV when I'm doing hiring committees that somebody's been on a postdoc or had one of those. I mean, it can certainly help you because you get a lot of publications out of it. I mean, it's not going to hurt by any means, but I've not seen it as a necessity for hiring now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any final questions for Travis? Excellent. Thank you so much, Travis. You've provided so much information.
Well, hey, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, y'all are welcome to email me anytime. I'm happy to chat with y'all. You know, it's a tough job sometimes. And so I'm always happy to help support folks.
Great. I'm sure that you'll hear from some of these people over time, for sure.
I look forward to it.
Yep. And great seeing so many of our students here. It's been fabulous.
Yeah, it was great to see some familiar faces.
Yep.
Congratulations, Travis, on being a dad. That's wonderful news. And this recording, by the way, will be posted onto YouTube, and I'm going to share it with Trina Crowley because I'm sure she's going to want to know how you're doing as well.
And Jack.
Are they successfully retiring, or are they those people that can't quite retire? Well, that's good.
So they are quite retired and enjoying it very much.
They deserve it.
Yeah, but I'll pass this on to them because I know that she would love to hear how you're doing, and so would Jack.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Remember that we have another colloquium on Wednesday, which is a very fast turnaround, which will be on qualitative ethnography, which is also related to big data. So it's another data science kind of thing. Every time Travis brought up data science, I was like, and come back Wednesday to hear more about another way of thinking about data science.
Is that with David Schaefer's work in ENA?
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. So this is the bigger picture of it, but I'm sure he'll be talking about ENA some too. You're welcome to join us, of course.
Yeah, I might try to if I'm available.
I'm going to make a note to send you the information.
Awesome. I appreciate that.
Uh-huh.
That was a cat, in case you heard that.
I'm going to stop the recording here.